Hi all, thank you so much for joining us in our webinar today, Long-Term Remote Work Strategies. We're excited to talk about a very pressing issue that's going on right now. We welcome all of your questions. So let's see if we can get into this. Just some background about PilieroMazza. We're a full-service business law firm. We have practice areas in labor and employment. Where I'm from, we have government contracting, law as well. Anna will talk a little bit about her work with GovCon. We also have a litigation practice as well as a corporate practice. And we're based primarily in Washington, D.C., although we also have our offices in Colorado and Annapolis, Maryland. I am Sarah Nash. I am an attorney in our labor and employment group. We work with clients on all types of labor and employment matters. It just so happens that remote work policies and practices have been one of our more popular areas of practice lately, just given COVID and a lot of the issues that are going on in the world right now. So we've been dealing quite heavily with that, teleworking policies, things of that nature. We also deal quite a bit with the GovCon side of things, and just making sure that government contractors know how to toe that line between satisfying the government customer, but also keeping in tow with labor and employment requirements. And Anna, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, yes, I am Anna Wright. I'm in the government contracts group. I'm an attorney. Most of my work focuses on bid protests and claims and a lot of cybersecurity and things of that nature. I do a teensy bit of work every now and then that crosses over into the L&E field. And I also do stuff with Sarah, like right now.
Exactly. Well, yeah, I mean, we're excited to be giving this talk, sort of one of the rare moments where our two teams can kind of work together and hopefully answer some questions about a topic that can be complicated. It doesn't have to be, but there are some rules of the road that you want to keep in mind. And if you implement certain policies and procedures up front, you can save yourself quite a bit of headaches down the line. So just to give you a rundown of what we're going to be talking about, we're going to be looking at some of the biggest issues that we see when it comes to employees working remotely. One of the bigger things that comes up is just making sure that you've considered data security risks and insider threats that might come up due to simply the fact that your workforce isn't necessarily in front of you. You know, when people are working remotely, it can be easier to be a little bit more lax about certain rules, especially when it comes to cybersecurity issues. And so a big part of this talk today is just going to be reminding you of the risks and why you really want to make sure that you have good policies and practices in place to make sure you're protecting your data, and to the extent you're a government contractor, keeping your obligations to the government. Another big issue that we see with remote employees is just being able to manage employee disputes and complaints. Often it can be a little bit harder if you're not actually in touch with employees. And so we'll just go over some tips for how to make sure that you are properly communicating with employees and making sure that they understand the rules and expectations. We'll also go over briefly some hiring and onboarding issues that come up when you're not necessarily meeting with people in person. And then lastly, some health and safety obligations that attach regardless of whether you're in the office or out of the office that are important to keep in mind. And so with that, I will kick it off to Anna to talk a little bit about what exactly is an insider threat.
Yeah, so an insider threat, you can see the definition right there. I pulled that directly from the NISPOM. It's the likelihood, risk, or potential that an insider will use his or her authorized access, wittingly or unwittingly, to do harm to the national security of the United States. So first, what's an insider? That can be an employee, an officer, somebody who has access to your company's systems, data, etc. And someone who has that access, as of course you know, can be a big vulnerability to both you as an employer because they have access to your proprietary information, and to the government because if you handle any classified information or like controlled unclassified information or anything sensitive like that, that could also put the government at risk if an employee were to leak or otherwise use that data in an unauthorized fashion. And according to IBM's X-Force Threat Intelligence Index report, about $11.5 million were lost during fiscal year 2019 due to insider threats. That number is both intentional breaches and unintentional breaches. So I'll get into this more later, but the fact that somebody accidentally leaks information that they shouldn't or misuses information doesn't mean that it's not an insider threat and doesn't mean that it's not an issue. So if we can go to the next slide. If you have any type of sensitive information, you need to be concerned about an insider threat. Of course, cleared contractors are specifically required to have an insider threat program in place. That's in the NISPOM. There are various executive orders about this. But anybody who has any valuable assets is vulnerable, whether you're cleared or not. Also, insider threats can apply to the extent that you, for example, process personally identifying information or other like sensitive information of that variety. Even if it's not governmental information, you still want to make sure that you protect that information, and you can still be vulnerable to a quote unquote insider threat just by nature of having this information and folks having access to that information during their work for you. And the next slide.
Hannah, can I just interject really quickly? For all of us out here who aren't necessarily GovCon wonks, can you explain NISPOM just briefly to just give a sense of where it comes from and what its implications are?
Yeah, sure thing. So the NISPOM is, I'm pulling it up right now, the National Industrial Security Program Operating Manual. That's why we call it NISPOM, because that is a mouthful. It's also under DoD 5220.22. It's the manual number in case you wanted to find it that way. The NISPOM is the guidebook of sorts that contractors, specifically cleared contractors, use and are required to use to protect their data. It has certain procedures that it prescribes, and various policies for the sorts of data you're supposed to protect, how you're supposed to do that, and it outlines like how you're supposed to submit reports and all that sort of stuff. So basically, the NISPOM is where you go when you need to deal with classified information.
Great, thanks.
So, what types of insider threats are there and what are their causes? So we have intentional or malicious versus negligent threats, as I touched on earlier. The fact that it was an accident doesn't mean it's any less damaging necessarily. Now, in fiscal year 2019, this is again according to the IBM X-Force report, there were 4,716 reported insider threat incidents. Note that's reported. There could be more that weren't reported because a lot of times people don't necessarily know that they've been compromised. 63% of those reported threats were attributable to either employee or contractor negligence. That cost about $4.58 million. So as you can see, that's both highest percentage and the highest dollar value. Now, dollar value per incident, of course, is higher for the criminal insider activity because that's what people think about. When you think insider threat, most people think criminal insider threat. I'm going to misuse this information intentionally in an unlawful fashion. While that is a problem, and yes, it's very expensive, it's not the only problem. And then finally, 23% were attributable to credential theft. That's when somebody who's not one of your employees or one of your officers steals credentials, and whether that's through phishing or what have you, but somehow they have acquired these credentials and they've gained unauthorized access to your system using those credentials. Next slide.
So that kind of brings us to, as you know, when you're working with a remote workforce, it can be very difficult to identify necessarily some of the warning signs that you might be more likely to see if someone was working in your office. And forgive me, I blew past one of our housekeeping items, which is that there is HRCI credit for this webinar. We will be circulating a code at the end of the hour. And so for anyone who's looking out for that code, it should come at the end of this webinar. But it's worth discussing some of the warning signs that you might see if there is an insider threat. And I should note that you can do this if you implement policies and procedures that have you in kind of constant communication with your workforce, regardless of whether they're working in an office with you or at a government site or remotely. These are sort of general rules that would apply regardless of who you're dealing with. And so some personal factors that we might see in employees that are often important to keep an eye on are anger, someone who's especially angry or expressing revenge about just general things in general. I mean, if it's directed obviously towards coworkers or towards the workplace in general, you want to keep additional attention on that. Another personal factor we might notice are employees who are compulsive or destructive. And again, just because these are some factors doesn't mean that everyone who has a bad day or everyone who exhibits some destructive behavior is going to go out and steal all your company secrets. But it is important to be vigilant and keep an eye out to make sure that your workforce isn't necessarily unhappy. And a good way to prevent, at least, and it's not just intentional misuse of company information, but unintentional misuse as well, right? So someone who's happier with the company and feels heard is going to perhaps be a little bit more careful when it comes to following policies and procedures to keep information safe. You might also want to look at certain behaviors that employees are exhibiting to see whether maybe they're more likely to be disseminating information either irresponsibly or intentionally. If you notice that generally in the workplace, this is a little bit easier, right? If you notice that someone's taking a lot of files out of the office or working at odd hours without company approval, that might sometimes send a red flag out that indicates, hey, there's no reason, at least, that this employee would be doing this work for their own business reasons. What are they doing with this information? And it's really worth looking into it and making sure that they're not misusing company property for some purpose. Another type of behavior you might look up is unnecessarily copying manuals or large volumes of materials. And we'll talk, I think, a little bit more throughout this webinar about how you can keep an eye on your workforce if they're not directly in front of you in the office. But there are ways that you can apply these same sort of vigilant tools to a remote workforce. It just requires a little bit more creativity and a little bit more planning as you do it. It's always going to be important that you're regularly communicating with remote workers. You want to make sure, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, that you have a clear telework policy that has clear expectations for what employees' hours are, how they're supposed to be checking in with their supervisors, and things of that nature to make sure that you have like a good open communication. Let's go on to the next slide. So what are some ways that employers can mitigate risks for the remote workforce? The biggest thing, and Anna can probably speak to this as well, is going to be making sure that you have clear policies and procedures in place. One of the policies that relates most directly to the remote workforce is going to be a comprehensive telework policy, right? You want to make sure that if you're going to allow employees to work remotely, that they have certain understandings of how their work is going to be completed. And I should preface this by saying that we can't talk about remote work without understanding that COVID-19 pandemic has really shaken up a lot of common business practices. So in 2018, the Bureau of Labor Statistics noted that about a quarter of the workforce was working remotely, at least some or all, for all of their work. So full-time or part-time employees were working remotely. That number, we don't have the actual statistics out now, but as you can imagine, that number skyrocketed in around March and April of 2020 when states began to implement stay-at-home orders. And for the first time, a lot of offices that have generally not permitted employees to work remotely have required on-site attendance, a lot of contracts as well, right? Were for the first time allowing employees to work remotely because that was really the only way that they would be able to work at all. And so for the first time, we have a lot of workforces sending their employees home and trying to scramble to come up with a lot of new policies for how this is going to work. And there are some benefits to working remotely, right? Generally, it's going to increase employee morale in some cases. It's going to lead to reduced overhead. It might be a good recruiting tool, and it allows companies to seek a broader talent base, right? So if you're not necessarily restricted to employees within a commutable distance of your primary office, that means you can look a little bit farther. You can look at employees who might not necessarily live in the same area. So it can be very beneficial, but there can also be some risks, which is what we're talking about today. So the whole point of today is trying to address those risks and make sure that if you do have a telework policy in place, which I think after this summer, a lot more companies are going to have this option available, then these are some things that you really want to keep in mind. So one of the things that you certainly want to have in your telework policy is going to be sort of an expectation for how, first of all, which employees are eligible for telework, but also which employees, what the process is for how you are to request telework. Obviously, right now, a lot of offices just have a blanket telework policy available for employees because it's not an option to come into the office. That said, as companies lift their teleworking and bring more and more people into the office, we're dealing with some of those growing pains of trying to figure out, do you allow people to continue to telework? What's your process? If you do, how do you deal with reasonable accommodations? A lot of these questions are popping up. So it's important to have a policy in place that addresses some of them head on so that you're not scrambling ad hoc every time someone submits a question, and you can sort of apply a policy across the board, of course, understanding that certain people, not everybody's the same. Some people have kids and can't necessarily send their kids to school in the fall, so they might have to have additional telework considerations. Some people have reasonable accommodation concerns. Maybe they're particularly vulnerable to COVID, so they might have doctor's notes that require that they work remotely. So there's just a few more issues that are going to be incorporated into this calculus for what a company should do to grant telework leave. Some other things that you want to consider in a telework policy include detailing. You want very clear expectations for the responsibilities of what an employee is going to be doing when they're working remotely. So you want to make sure that it's clear what their work hours are, how they're supposed to clock in the morning, who they're supposed to be in touch with. Do you want them checking in on a daily basis, on a weekly basis? What's your expectations? And this, of course, is going to vary by industry, by company. No two situations are going to be the same. You're also going to want to make clear how you want this employee to be communicating with their supervisor. Is an email sufficient? Do you want daily calls? Some companies use the chat service Slack. It's like a chat, kind of like GChat. You can chat to people throughout the day. It's always going to be, especially in this insider threat context, important that you have ongoing communications with people so that you understand what they're going through, what they're working on, and make sure that you understand how they're spending their time. You also might want to make clear, for example, if you provide a laptop, other company property, what the expectations are for safeguarding that company equipment, especially if it's going to have confidential information on it. Do you require employees to have a password when they log into their computer, things of that issue? I'll let Anna talk about that when we get to cybersecurity requirements. But just generally, you want to be thinking about how you're going to set up this employee in their workspace. Are you going to be providing an office chair or a desk, or is this something that you expect of the employee? These are all sort of questions that you can think about ahead of the time, put into your policy, and make sure that you're sort of addressing big questions that might come up. For example, where the employee is going to be working, things of that nature, when they're going to be taking breaks. Anna, did you want to speak a little bit to a cybersecurity policy or requirements that you might also want to make sure are up to date?
Sure, yeah. So cybersecurity is a pretty it's a pretty broad term. I'm using it to encompass not only the sort of software or hardware requirements that you might have on your company systems, but also the particular behaviors that you either require or reinforce with your employees. So in terms of software or hardware, firewalls, for example, are always a good idea. Blocking certain sites from, suppose you use a cloud provider and your employees access all your information from that. Blocking download of confidential material is always a good idea. You can accomplish that various ways. And then if you allow access, to the outside web through your cloud, then that's where a firewall can come in handy as well. Antivirus software, requiring your employees to have antivirus software to run scans on their computers at certain times or with certain frequency. That's definitely a good idea. And then just for the training side and the human element, because of course, like we mentioned earlier, unintentional breaches are just as damaging as, or can be just as damaging as, intentional breaches. So to keep unintentional breaches from happening and to keep credentials from being stolen, it's a good idea to teach your employees how to have good, using scare quotes here, cyber hygiene. And so a part of that is exercising critical thinking about what you do on the internet or on an internet-enabled device. So that can include things like don't click the sketchy link in the email that looks spoofed. Don't go to the sketchy website. Stuff like that you might not think about on a daily basis. You really should be thinking about this, especially with people being so spread out right now with teleworking. You need to have these policies in place that tell people, like, do this, don't do that, because normally maybe they would be able to talk to someone and be like, hey, I got this email. What is this? Did you send this? Did someone else send this? What is this? And that access is a little bit more difficult right now. So you want to have a clear requirement or guideline in place that tells employees what to do if they receive a weird email, or if something just feels off. What happens if they get a virus? You need to address these things to mitigate some of these issues before they start. And if you would like specific examples of ways this can be done, I'm happy to talk about this, but I don't want to go off ad nauseum about specific cybersecurity requirements. So I'll stop there for now.
Certainly. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out through the question slot or via our email after the talk, and we're happy to talk about specifics. But we've really been seeing an uptick in spam and phishing out there, likely because internet spammers are noting that a lot of people are working remotely for the first time. And sometimes some of this stuff can feel a little bit over the top, especially if you're not necessarily dealing with that classified information. It can sort of feel like, what am I going through all these hoops just to be paranoid about information that's out there and about the boogeyman who's coming to get me when there's no one coming to get me. But that's what everybody says right before it happens. And the damages and the cost can be so tremendous that it's worth just putting in a little bit of time and thought on the front end so that you can avoid some really catastrophic results on the back end. Especially if you haven't necessarily been training employees about information security and you're dealing with a workforce who really doesn't maybe understand the importance of having a good password or not clicking on some suspicious file that just got emailed. You also want to make sure that, and this is important when you have, I'd say, a remote workforce even more so, you want to make sure you have designated individuals who are assigned to important areas for insider threat mitigation. So this might mean a designated person who receives questions about personnel, human resources issues, a designated person for IT, a designated person for training and legal and things of that nature. Because when you're all spread out, especially if you have employees who really aren't coming into the workforce at all, it's hard to remember that these are, it's not just about the work being done, but it's about the health of the company overall. And so you want to make sure that you have in place that overarching network to make sure that if these questions do come up, you have something in place to address it and you're not sort of reinventing the wheel every time. You also want to make sure that you make very clear to your workforce how they can report a problem, and at the same time making sure that you have a clear non-retaliation policy in place. So if an employee sees something suspicious, you want it to be very clear to them who they're supposed to go to report that to the company. And you also want to make clear that they have an obligation to report that to the company, right? Because sometimes employees, just people in general, don't always know if what they've observed is something worth sharing. And so often this is something that you will address in company handbooks. And if you're lucky, someone actually paid attention to what's in the company handbook. But as most of you know, often people just sign and then figure it out later. So especially if you have a handbook that's not necessarily available online, that's maybe stuck in someone's desk at the office, it's not going to be easy to review what's in there. So it's important to remind employees where they can access this information, remind them about what the company's, who at the company should they reach out to. When they're in the office, it's as easy as walking down the hall. It might be a little bit harder if you need to call someone's cell phone or send them an email. It's just important to have those expectations clearly defined. So I have a little bit of a polling question for you now, and let's read through it, and then we can see if people have ideas about how they might respond to something like this. And I'll preface this by saying there's no real right answer here, but it is important to think through some of these things, and often the snap reaction isn't always going to be the best reaction. So this is the question I have for you. A remote employee is performing poorly on the job and is not responding to company emails in a professional way. What personnel action would you recommend in response? A, terminate the employee. They clearly aren't up for the job. B, create a blanket policy that requires employees to return to the office and discontinue the telework policy for everyone. C, write the employee up through the company's regular disciplinary process. Or D, discontinue telework for this particular employee. So I'm going to bring up the polling question, and if you have an opinion, please chime in, and then we'll take a look at what we have. Okay, we've got about 65%, so I'm gonna attempt to close the poll and then share the results. So we've got about 77% of people who say write the employee up through the regular disciplinary processes. About 15% say discontinue telework for this particular employee. And then about 8% say create a blanket policy requiring everyone to return to work. And like I said, there's no right answer here. Generally, and this can depend on circumstances, right? If someone has clearly gone, maybe engaged in time fraud or done something particularly awful, it might be a good idea to require them to return from their teleworking position. That said, in some instances, especially now, right, in COVID climate, it's sometimes hard to require someone to return to the office, especially with considerations out there of health and safety. So generally what I would recommend in this situation is to write up the employee through the company's regular disciplinary procedures, right? You write them up, you let them know exactly what expectations they're not meeting, and you see if they get better. Another approach might be, for example, to put them on a performance improvement plan, or let them know that this is their last chance, and if they don't get better, they're going to have to stop teleworking. They're no longer going to have that privilege, assuming that's an option. Sometimes you have employees who are maybe out of state who aren't necessarily able to come into the office, and so that kind of complicates the calculus just a little bit. But I would not create a blanket policy that requires everyone to return to the office. That generally is going to be a little bit of an issue, especially if you have people who need a reasonable accommodation, who are maybe a little bit more concerned about some health issues because of COVID. And so it's just important that you don't have like a knee-jerk reaction to, well, this isn't working, we need to start over, blaze the whole thing to the ground and start from scratch. I would recommend that you maybe talk to the employee, because for the first time, a lot of employees are in a situation where they're working remotely and they don't necessarily know the best way to perform their work. It can be challenging, especially if they're working from home with other with children who are maybe distracting them, or other individuals, and so they're trying to figure out the best way to perform their work. Another strategy might be to make sure that they have a workspace where they're able to perform work, so that they know that they can go somewhere when they do have to focus and keep their eyes on what's important. Got a question, so I'm gonna, let's see if I can bring up the question. Of course, it's struggling a little bit. So part of the problem of someone required to work in the office is supervision. Great observation. What supervisor will commit to be in there when the problematic employee is in? I mean, that's another issue, right? If you just have one employee who you're going to make come into the office, you still need someone to supervise them. And so I would posit that technically it should be, you should be just as capable of supervising a remote employee as you are one who's in the office. Because in the office, it's not like the supervisor's job is just sit there and stare at the employee all day, right? Rather, you have maybe expectations of when they're at their desk. You have expectations of the work product that they're supposed to be completing, and you have expectations for how they're supposed to show their progress. And part of the challenge of working with remote employees is just figuring out the best way to get that information when someone's not in the office. Okay, let's go to the next. Okay, next slide. So what are some unique considerations for onboarding a remote workforce? One of the biggest issues you're going to want to make sure of is whenever an employee starts, right, you hand out a bunch of materials. You might ask them to sign the company handbook. You might ask them to sign an employment agreement that spells out important confidentiality requirements and certain non-compete and work share obligations. And so it can be easy to just send off these things to employees without necessarily getting their acknowledgement of receipt back. And you generally want to make sure that you have something that proves not just that you sent it to the employee, but they received it. And so it's generally a good idea when you have people who are starting, even if you send them something, to make sure that they either go online. A lot of companies will use an online acknowledgement kind of signature. So you have employees go on, acknowledge that they've received each of the different policies that have been handed out. Or you can just have them, sometimes it's as easy as responding to an email, just letting them know that they received the handbook or whatever it is. You also don't want to forget certain employee training obligations when you have a remote workforce. A lot of states nowadays, California, New York, to name a few, require sexual harassment training. And this can at times depend on the number of employees that you have working in a state. So you want to make sure that if you do have remote employees working in some of those states that tend to have some more stringent workplace requirements, that you are complying with those obligations. Another issue that might come up is sick leave. You'd be surprised how many states nowadays do require some amount of sick leave. And sometimes those states have an employees threshold. So say you have to have at least 50 employees in the state. But sometimes sorry, I'm just seeing some questions. Apologies that I kept the poll up for such a long time. Took me a minute to realize I was just showing that for a while. Anyway, so you want to make sure that you're complying with specific state policies. And if you have a number of people working, even if that's not your primary offices, there could be some other additional requirements that attach. Timekeeping training is also a hugely important thing to keep in mind when you have employees working remotely. One of the biggest reasons for this, I'll talk about the FLSA implications from an HR perspective, and maybe Anna can talk a little bit about the government contracting side. But when you have employees working remotely, especially if those are hourly employees who are non-exempt and who are owed overtime, if they work over 40 hours in a work week, it's really important to make sure that they are properly keeping track of the hours that they work. As an employer, it's your obligation to basically pay employees for each hour of time they worked and make sure that they're paying overtime for any hours worked over 40, right? And it can be hard if you don't have a good timekeeping policy in place to know exactly when an employee is working. This comes up especially in the remote workforce because it's so easy nowadays to send an email at really any time of the day, right? Some people, especially if you have kids, can't necessarily focus on your work 9 to 5. And so you are sending emails at 10 p.m., 2 in the morning. And it's important to realize if you are dealing with employees who are non-exempt, those hourly employees, you have an obligation to pay them for all hours worked. And so if they're responding to emails at weird hours of the day, you really want to make sure that they have a clear understanding of keeping track of their time and making sure that everyone's on the same page about when they're supposed to be working and that they're keeping track of when they're working. Because if you don't, you can run into FLSA issues. Anna, do you have anything about timekeeping or ethics training that you might also want to add from a GovCon perspective?
I sure do. So timekeeping is a fairly substantial area. If you're a government contractor, you probably are at least somewhat familiar with the False Claims Act. There's the Civil False Claims Act, and there's the Criminal Act as well. They each have different penalties associated with them, of course. But the main issue is that if you make a false claim, which is generally defined as a request for payment to the government, then you are on the hook for all kinds of fun things, including treble damages, possibly termination for default of your contract. You really don't want to go there. Even jail time, fines, etc. for criminal violations. It's really not a good time. So one of the ways that False Claims Act liability often comes up is people improperly billing for time that wasn't actually worked. So you want to really make sure that when your employees are filling out their timesheets, they actually worked that time. So they're not saying, yeah, no, I totally worked 8 hours on Monday, but they were actually only sitting at their desk for 2 of those hours. That's not good, because those 6 hours that they weren't working, you're now liable to the government for that false claim. Because if you're requesting the government to reimburse you for that amount of time that your employee worked and billed to a government contract, you've now submitted a false claim or a fraudulent claim to the government, and that's not good. Another thing you also are not supposed to do in performing a government contract is fill out your timesheets early. So if you have your employees fill out, say, a week in advance, like suppose you get toward the end of a month and your billing cycle stops 5 days before the end of the month. I'm just making things up here. I have actually not heard of someone who does this, but it could happen. And then you require your employees to fill in their timesheets for up to the end of that month. That's not good. You shouldn't do that, because that ends up bringing you into False Claims Act territory. Just it can on its own, but also if the government realizes that you didn't work that time, then you're going to have a big problem. And that kind of ties into the ethics training as well. That timekeeping does have some ethics crossover, at least as far as the government is concerned. So there are some ethics guidelines for timekeeping, but also just in general, you still want to make sure, because ethics rules don't stop when you go home or when you work from home. You still have a responsibility to conduct your business in an ethical fashion. And the government has some very, very specific ideas as to what ethical entails. So that includes things like don't give kickbacks. The Anti-Kickback Act still applies. Gifts to government employees, all that kind of stuff. All of that still applies, even if you're working at home. You don't have to be working in an office for these ethics requirements to apply. So that is something you're going to want to teach your employees about, is what are these ethics rules? What is your responsibility as an employee to uphold these ethics rules? And what's the responsibility of the company in general?
Thanks, Anna. That's really helpful.
I think we have a question.
How does the requirement to keep the staff available under the CARES Act apply to actual work time? So I think what that question is getting at is under the CARES Act, and correct me if I'm wrong, it could be, I could be talking to another point, but this is equally maybe relevant. There is a PPP loan for those of you who might be paying attention to the news that essentially gives you a loan that you don't have to pay back, assuming that you meet certain employee retention obligations. And technically, all that this requirement says is that you have to keep employees on the payroll. And so it doesn't mean that they actually need to be working on anything. If you just want to pay employees to stay home, that is more than okay under the PPP loan guidelines. And so there really isn't a need to have actual work time reflected. You just need to show that you've been paying your payroll and you have all those employees that you started out with that you're still either paying them or that you've replaced them with other people that you're paying. Those are really the requirements there. Anna, you mentioned something that applies just as well to the sort of human resources FLSA side of things, which is as much as you might want to fill out time sheets ahead of time, whether it's for exempt employees or non-exempt employees, because hey, they come in at 5, they leave it, or they come in at 8, they leave at 5 every day. Why not just fill it out the same day every way? It's really a bad idea, not only for the government contracting reasons Anna noted, but also because if DOL comes in and performs an audit, they are especially suspicious of timesheets that say the same thing day in and day out over and over again, because we all know people are late from time to time. Accidents happen, things come up. You know, traffic isn't a big deal in this sort of remote work world, but you know, things happen. And so it's important that you're actually reflecting actual time spent. And you want to make this clear to employees, first of all, that they are expected to put down their actual work that they've been doing. There's also an expectation that there's no off the clock time. They need to be made clear that they are not to work at any point during which they say they're not working. And that's especially important. There's also sort of this, if you guys are familiar with the onboarding process, you know that an integral part of that is going to be collecting I-9s from employees that sort of, you know, verify that they're authorized to work in the US. For the time being, the Department of Homeland Security has exempted the general requirement that as part of that process, employees need to show you a physical copy of their passport or their green card or whatever it is that gives proof that they're eligible to work in the United States. So at last time I checked, I think it was a few days ago, they had updated the website and said that for another 30 days, they are allowing employers to use essentially, you know, a virtual method of confirming that employees have their passport within those 3 days of employment. That is temporary, however. It's not going to be around forever. My guess, as soon as this pandemic lifts and more states go back to work, they're going to change their mind on that exemption. And it's important to realize that when you have a remote workforce, especially people who are not working necessarily in the same area as your general headquarters, you still need someone to be available to check those I-9 documents. So right now there's an exception. You can do it via Zoom or whatever your portal is. But in the next month or 2 months, depending on how things play out, that will not be an option. So just keep in mind, if you do have people working remotely, there still is going to be an obligation to physically inspect those documents. I'll also note that just because the exception has been applied now doesn't mean that those employees that you verify remotely, that's sufficient. As soon as it's lifted, that DHS guidelines say that you have to physically inspect those documents of people that you have hired during the pandemic. I have a question. What if you have exempted employees? Are you saying the employee needs to have exact time reported on their timesheet? So this can depend on your contract, right? But if you have exempt employees and you still have a time and materials contract, or you're still required to submit your hours for employees to the government, Anna, correct me if you see anything else wrong with this, but you still have an obligation to submit accurate timekeeping records, especially if you're on a time and materials contract.
Yep, that's exactly what I was going to say. Yes.
Oh, perfect. Okay. What did I do? Okay. Next up, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, briefly just chat about some additional health and safety concerns. You want to make sure that you have considered any ADA accommodation that an employee requests. And this is even if you don't have a telework policy. One of the more common accommodations that individuals with disabilities have requested recently is an ability to work remotely. And of course, there can be some restrictions on whether you can even grant someone permission to work remotely. Perhaps they really can't do their job duties remotely, or perhaps your government customer does not permit employees to work remotely for whatever reason. Those are things you want to consider, in which case you can argue that you have an undue hardship that prevents you from allowing this employee to telework. That said, now that everybody's been working remotely for the past 3 or 4 months, it will be a little bit harder to argue, for example, that you are unable for business reasons to submit or to allow an employee to work remotely. So you just want to keep in mind, I'd say it is worth a conversation with a customer. If you think that they're going to say no, you still should. There's an obligation. It's called going through the interactive process. You still have an obligation to talk through potential accommodations that might work for an employee asking for one. And so it's worth going to your customer and asking them explicitly. If they say no, then they say no, there's no obligation. But it will really cover you down the line if someone does try to raise an ADA discrimination claim. Another concern with ADA accommodations is just making sure that employees who are already teleworking, they may also have additional accommodation needs. So you just want to make sure that you have a clear ADA accommodation policy in your handbook, and that you clearly just make sure that employees know who they can talk to if they do need an accommodation request. With respect to workers' compensation, because employees who work remotely are going to be performing work for the employer, they would technically be entitled to workers' compensation. You want to make sure in your telework policy that you're clearly defining that employees need to contact the employer immediately if they are injured while performing work. You also probably want to make clear that if any injuries occur to third parties who are also happen to be working remotely in their employees area, that they're not covered by your workers' comp plan. Anyway, so those are just the quick health and safety concerns that might come up. We touched on this a little bit, but this final slide just talks a little bit about potential penalties for a violation. Essentially that, what's the big deal if I don't do these things? Anna talked about False Claims Act liability. You can have significant, I think it's treble damages for a violation, intentional misrepresentation of time. So if you do have a reason to suspect that your employee isn't working the hours that they say they're working and you bill those to the government, that could be an issue. So it's better to just keep track of hours and ask people if you're not sure. There are also wage and hour laws. Yeah, go ahead, Anna.
Well, I was just going to say the False Claims Act also applies to, well, the Civil False Claims Act also applies to unintentional false claims. So you really want to be sure when you sign something to the government and you certify that what you're saying is correct, you want to make sure that it is correct. Because even if you didn't know that it was wrong at the time you submitted it, you can still be on the hook for liability. However, a way to mitigate that liability is to investigate right away. It doesn't mean you're going to get out completely scot-free, but it can help mitigate if you cooperate with government immediately, if you let them know, gee, this person filled out their timesheet wrong. This is the amount that's wrong. We'll fix it by refunding you. That's a way that you could mitigate your False Claims Act liability. But really, the best way to mitigate liability is to just not be there in the first place.
Absolutely. And we received a question about firm fixed price contracts. If you're not summarizing hours to the government, then there's no requirement that for example, your exempt employees are marking the amount of hours that they're spending. Although if you are submitting a summary of hours, that's when you really need to make sure that those summaries are accurate, regardless really of whether you're billing the government dollar for dollar, depending on the number of hours worked. You also
ultimately
want to be, yeah.
Sorry. Ultimately, what does your contract say? If your contract has a specific requirement related to hours worked or anything like that, even if it's a firm fixed price contract, you still need to abide by the requirements of the contract. So really, to answer that question, you need to look at what your contract says and then act accordingly.
Great. Thanks, Anna. Also, wage and hour laws, as we touched on, it's important for your non-exempts to make sure that you have a clear understanding of when they're working, to make sure that they're paid time and a half for any hours worked over 40. If you're in a state that requires a meal period like California, you want to be extra careful about making sure that they're taking breaks at the right times. As a reminder, any breaks under 20 minutes must be paid. And so just making sure that employees who are working remotely are also aware of these requirements is a really important consideration. Anna, are there any other government repercussions that might come up other than the False Claims Act liability issue?
The False Claims Act is really the main one, but again, it is going to depend on the specific contract because contracts can have particular clauses in them or just provisions that are part of the performance work statement or a statement of work or what have you that would impose certain penalties. It really varies based on the particular terms of the contract. That's something I say all the time, but it's very true here. You can definitely have specific repercussions under specific contracts.
Great. Yeah, and if your contract says something, for example, it says that I'll comply with all wage and hour laws. You're not just obligated under those wage and hour laws, but you've contractually agreed to these issues. So you want to make sure that you're complying to the extent that a violation could be seen as a violation of your contract overall. So we sort of whizzed through a lot of those issues that come up in the remote work context. If after today you have any questions, these are email addresses. Please feel free to reach out to us directly. But that's really what we had for you today. Anna, did you have any other thoughts before signing off?
Other than the code that we will need to give, not really. Oh, I did have one. If the CARES Act question, the requirement is to keep staff available. If you're referring to the requirement to keep your staff in a ready state, that's about paid leave, not billing under specific government contracts. So it's a slightly different issue than a timesheet issue exactly. We have a number of blogs about this on our website. And of course, we can talk about this more individually if you like, but just as a heads up, the ready state requirement isn't necessarily related to filling out your timesheets for a specific contract.
That's a great point. Thanks for reminding me. Also, there is, yeah, if for some reason you have a government contract, they've also promulgated as part of the CARES Act some requirements to give people a little bit more flexibility during this time. And so it's possible that the government, even if you're not performing work, would be willing to pay you for services, even if you're not necessarily performing work there. Thanks so much for joining us. And again, please feel free to reach out to us offline if you have any more specific questions. Thanks so much.